Welcome to this forum on fracking and agriculture. We're really pleased you could all come today. I imagine a few more people will be trickling in. But my name is Ann Thrupp, and I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Food Institute. And I want to thank you all for coming today. This is part of a series that we've been having, the Food Exchange Forums, addressing contemporary important issues on agriculture and food systems. And some of you have been to some of the forums that we've had previously. This is our first in this year, so we're delighted to have a group of people to speak to you about this hot topic. We're pleased and honored to have Edwin Dobb, who's our moderator for today's discussion. And Ed is a Carnegie Lecturer in the Graduate School of Journalism here at Berkeley. And he teaches classes in narrative writing and literary nonfiction and environmental journalism. Ed is a former editor-in-chief of the Sciences magazine and has written for numerous national magazines. And you can see more information about Ed and also the other speakers in your program if you pick that up at the front. So also Ed has written a fascinating article that recently was published in the National Geographic. And there are copies of that. There's some display copies if you're interested in reading that. So Ed will introduce our four distinguished panelists today. And we're also really pleased to have them and appreciate their time today. The format that we use is that each of the speakers will have about 5 to 8 minutes to give kind of an introduction of their perspective on the issue after Ed introduces the issue. And then we'll open it up for, Ed will do a moderated discussion with the panelists to discuss different questions related to fracking and agriculture. And then after that, it'll be followed by questions and answers from you and an open discussion. And we'll end with a reception in the area here, the hall area, afterwards, where we want to invite you to continue to join the conversation and to meet with the speakers as well. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I want to introduce Ed Dobb.
Thank you, Ann. Can everybody hear me? I wanted to briefly set the stage before we start because there's some misunderstanding around the term fracking that I think we should just address at the beginning. And perhaps all of you are aware of this, but just bear with me. What we've seen, and this is a simplified version, what we've seen is a marriage of profound implication of a couple different technologies. One of them is hydrological fracturing, which is the technique by which water, chemicals, and sand or artificial sand are driven into wellbores under high pressure, and to stimulate the rock, as it's called, is basically open up fissures that already exist or create new ones to allow oil and gas to escape. It's a technology that has been around for decades, a long, long time, and but it has been perfected and become more efficient in recent years. That has been wedded to horizontal drilling, which is, as it implies, is just a way of not only going way down to these deep shale layers that contain oil and gas, but also drilling out laterally over long, long distances, 2 to 3 miles now in the Bakken oil field in western North Dakota, which was the subject of my piece in National Geographic. Mark just told me there's a rig off Santa Barbara that's going out as far as 6.5 miles. That technology combined with fracking has allowed us as a civilization to gain access to these vast deposits of oil and gas that are distributed over large but narrow layers of often shale sedimentary rock. So that's what we're talking about, is the combination of those two technologies, which has brought about this revolution that's going global now in terms of increase in oil and gas development. We've heard a lot about the effects, potential effects, negative effects of fracking in terms of water contamination, water depletion, earthquakes related to injection wells and that sort of thing. The purpose today is to look at the effects on agriculture, on sustainable agriculture, the food supply, rural communities, farming, and specifically to ask a couple of big questions. Can these two enterprises coexist? Is there a way of doing it better in terms of regulation, monitoring, enforcement that might reduce the impacts, any negative impacts, and questions of that manner. So we're gonna everyone, as Ann said, everyone will get a chance to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll open up. I'm going to just do a quick introduction because you have the longer bios in your pieces. So Seth Shonkoff is the executive director of PSC for Health Energy. He's also an environmental researcher at UC Berkeley. To his left is Tom France, who's a farmer, longtime farmer in Kern County, California, anti-fracking activist. To his left is Holland Kretzmann, staff attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity, and then Mark Nekadam, who's the director of the California Department of Conservation. So we'll start with Seth. You're up.
All right. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me here and for coming to listen to all of us speak. So what I'm going to do, I was actually going to talk about how fracking is a problematic term, but I get to just skip over that, so maybe my comments will be actually on time. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about California-specific issues around fracking and other forms of oil development that are enabled by fracking and well stimulation. And I'm going to sort of just give a very quick overview of some of the broad categories where we can see potential pathways where agriculture and oil and gas development may exist in a situation where there might be negative impacts on agriculture. So I'm going to break this up into 4 categories. One are surface pathways. The next are subsurface pathways under the ground. The next is atmospheric pathways. And the last is psychosocial and perception risks to agriculture. So the first category has a chemical component to it, and that's the surface pathways. All of these actually have chemical components to them. But so recently, the most recent big analysis of all of the chemicals that get used in stimulation fluids in California was part of this report. I was on the steering committee of it, and it was a big report that came out of the California Council on Science and Technology. So, one chemical finding was that there were a small number of compounds that are used relatively routinely in hydraulic fracturing in California that are extremely toxic. There is a larger body of chemicals that were found to be either moderately toxic or not very toxic, but you wouldn't necessarily want them in your water. And then about 30% of all chemicals used had no toxicity information that could be found whatsoever. So this is a huge data gap. So one thing that we do know in terms of surface pathways is that there are at least 6 water districts in the state of California that use produced water, which is basically part of what flows back up out of the well after you inject these stimulation fluids. They use produced water for irrigation of agricultural systems. One thing to note is that the monitoring of this produced water in most of these 6 water districts only requires that total dissolved solids be monitored for. So that's mostly salt. Some of them also look at arsenic and boron, but there are, in some cases, 50 more chemicals that get put into each sort of mix that goes into stimulating a well. So there are two things going on. One, we are not monitoring for things that we know are going in, and two, remember that 30%, we can't monitor for things that we don't know about. So those are some potential pathways through which chemicals can go into agricultural systems. Other pathways are surface spills. Tom might talk a little bit about surface spills. Some of these, there have been some that have been documented in California. There have been many more that have been documented across the country. So in terms of subsurface or under the ground pathways, the way that some potential pathways that oil and gas development could negatively impact agriculture are in California. Unlike other states, the majority of our hydraulic fracturing takes place in the southwestern corner of the San Joaquin Valley. And it doesn't take place in shale, which is what the majority of the other oil and gas that's being developed through hydraulic fracturing in, say, North Dakota or Pennsylvania. It's in this rock called diatomite, and the diatomites happen to be not too deep down below the aquifers. So there is abnormally shallow hydraulic fracturing happening in California, which may or may not be contributing to pathways, subsurface pathways that fluids, both gaseous and liquid, may travel up to aquifers, which may contain water that is protected and usable. There has been no monitoring, no real thorough monitoring of these aquifers and what it means. So we can't say either way, but it's certainly different and concerning. The disposal of produced water into underground injection wells. Recently, if you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen that a number of underground injection wells have been shut down, largely because they are injecting fluids into aquifers that may actually contain water that could be used in the future, especially as we move deeper and deeper into a situation where we're expecting to see more severe and frequent droughts, especially in the state of California. In terms of atmospheric pathways, it's been long known that that if you have elevated concentrations of tropospheric ozone, or otherwise known as smog, this can negatively affect the yield of certain agricultural plants and other plants, for that matter. Ozone, at least the ozone that is associated with oil and gas development, is from, well, oil and gas is known to emit a number of compounds, volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, which when they sit in the atmosphere under conditions usually of more elevated heat and sunlight, they can atmospherically transform to ozone. The majority of the hydraulic fracturing, again, in California occurs in the Central Valley, and the Central Valley is already usually in non-attainment status for its ozone concentrations. And the last is sort of like an exploratory category, the perception of risk by farmers and agricultural product producers. In talking to people across the country, people being farmers across the country who are worried about hydraulic fracturing, these oil and gas operations moving in close proximity to their fields, Some of them are worried about the environmental risk, but others are worried about the perception that their agricultural products may somehow be less pure or less organic or less X than those producers who don't have oil and gas next door or in their fields or what have you. So very broad overview, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Okay, thanks, Seth. Tom, you want to take it?
Okay, so I'm the person who actually lives and farms in the fields where drilling and fracking is going on in Kern County. I mean, immediately west of me, 2 miles, north 6 miles, and west about 5 miles, there are wells being drilled by a huge oil company named Occidental Petroleum. And they are boring holes 15,000 feet long at least, the horizontal and the vertical combined. And they are fracking those wells. The truck traffic is tremendous. The energy being used that I observe is tremendous, these operations. The drilling rigs are huge. They tower above the fields. It's a real invasive industry in the sense of coming in and doing what they want and nobody can stop them. There's nothing you can do as a farmer. You may have oil rights and you may have leased them out, but most farmers don't even have the mineral rights. So one day there's a knock on the door and the oil company says, we're going to drill on this side of your field. We need about 3 acres. We're going to put 3 or 4 wells in there. They usually need about 1 acre average per well. And then they come in. They don't pay you any rent for taking your land, but you do have the option of negotiating damages with the oil company. The only farmer I heard of who tried to refuse them to come in was threatened with a lawsuit and a penalty of up to $100,000 a day if he refused to let the oil company come in and drill exactly where they want it. So they come in and they set up this huge rig, and they don't put up a big cement pad and try and contain everything. It's right in the dirt, right next to your field where you're irrigating. And they drill the hole for 4 to 6 weeks. They've got 3,000 or 4,000 horsepower generators running 24 hours a day. We live in an area with the worst air pollution in the nation in Kern County, in Bakersfield. And this is adding to it. I mean, it's really energy intensive, and there's diesel engines running nonstop while they drill the wells. And they dig these big pits for the drilling mud, 150 feet long and 50 feet wide, right next to your fields. And the drilling mud's going in there, but it's an oil-based drilling mud. They're mixing crude oil or diesel with the clay mud to lubricate this drill bit as it's going down so deep. And everything is circulating into these pits. Well, some farmer friends of mine have observed, because they live so close, the trucks backing up to these pits, dumping other fluids into them while the drilling's going on. They're using these pits as disposal of produced water, most likely. We're not sure what they were putting in there, but nobody ever checked. And then one day I decided to videotape what I thought was an actual fracking operation, because it was just 2 miles from my house on a Saturday afternoon. And I stood there under the shade of an almond tree, videotaping ugly discharge into the pit while they pressure tested the well prior to fracking. And I sent the video to the Regional Water Board. They said that's totally illegal. They investigated, they fined the company, but they didn't ask the company to clean up their mess that they had illegally discharged. Today there are about 150 of these drilling mud pits with who knows what in them. The oil company was caught illegally discharging formally. They were observed illegally discharging into these pits informally on numerous occasions. Now these pits are buried and the earth is smoothed over. There's a well pumping beside, but sometimes the farmer's giving this land back to farm. Just the other day I was looking to where one farmer had planted almond trees. They're not growing, they're all dead, above where a pit was. I was looking at another field where cotton was planted this year. It's all dead. It won't grow above these pits. The water can't even hardly go down, but we know the irrigation water is soaking into these pits. And that's the best way to contaminate our groundwater right there, with whatever's in those pits being saturated by irrigation water, and then it's just seeping through the soil from the top down. as a farmer, I know the history of my area. Both my grandfathers and one great-grandfather were farmers within miles of where I live today, in the house I was raised in. And I'm farming 36 acres of almonds there right now. We know that everything we've spilled on the ground 50, 60 years ago is now in our groundwater, from the nitrates to chemicals like 1,2,3-TCP, a cancer-causing chemical banned 40 years ago. It was used with fumigants 50 years ago. It was banned 40 years ago. Today, my drinking water from the city of Shafter has increasing levels of this cancer-causing chemical in it that's not even regulated formally yet by the Department of Health. But they're working on it. They've been working on it for 10 years. But this is something banned 40 years ago. Now we have these pits and other spills that are on the ground. The drilling is very messy. When they pull the drilling rig away, it's a bloody hole of mud where that rig was sitting. And who knows what made all that mud around there that they leave behind. The Regional Water Board said you can't use these pits anymore, which is a good thing. But there's still 150 of them sitting there ready to contaminate our groundwater in about 50 years. That's a big issue. Now these wells, we read about how the wells will fail eventually. The other day I was looking at an injection well that used to pump oil where they're injecting wastewater, and the gauge said 950 pounds PSI. You know, under high pressure they're injecting wastewater deep into the ground through holes punched through our groundwater. Eventually something will give way and the contamination will start to spread. Initially they'll say this is just one isolated event. It's too bad this area's groundwater is now contaminated. But that's going to spread over 50 years into virtually the whole region's aquifer. It's not going to stay in one place. Our water moves from the Sierra Mountains into our aquifer and flows to the west, and it has a natural drainage northwards finally into the delta. And that's where a lot of this contamination will ultimately end up in a couple hundred years. It's an invasive industry. It's scary looking, and they do what they want. There's no regulation. SB4, to me, looks like something that's going to find a problem after it's happened. It's not going to prevent anything, which is very unfortunate. We don't have the regulation we need yet to protect things. We're growing things like, we're growing almonds and pistachios, but we have grapes, carrots, onions, potatoes, things that grow near the surface, like a grape 100 feet from an oil well. That grape is, through the air, is absorbing things like methane, benzene, toluene, and other toxic chemicals just through the air. And the air is contaminating the soil those grapes are growing in. These are nice table grapes you buy in the grocery store. Sometimes they're organic, sometimes they're not, but it's all growing in our area. So I'm concerned about the quality of our food and the quality of our soil, our air quality, and our water quality. It all relates to the quality of the food we're growing now and 50 years from now. And if we're not using a precautionary approach at this time, we're going to be really sorry in the time of our next generation or the generation after. And it's going to be on us and we'll be gone. I don't like to see that.
Okay, Tom, thanks. Holland, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Holland. I work for the Center for Biological Diversity. I think Seth and Tom did a really good job of describing a lot of the environmental and health risks that come along with fracking. One issue that hasn't been raised is actually a broad concern for all of agriculture, and it doesn't matter how far away you get from a well, and that's climate change. And fracking has a lot to do with exacerbating the effects of climate change. Not only is there a pretty significant footprint of all the construction that goes into the well site, the large diesel engines that create the pressure that's big enough to shatter the geologic formations underneath. Those are constantly running. The extraction, the refining, and ultimately the combustion of the final oil or gas product. These are all contributing to changing the climate, and that can mean different things for different farmers. For some parts of the country, that's going to mean extreme heat. For other parts, it might be more frequent and more severe flooding. For California, it's likely to result in more severe and longer-lasting droughts, and we're As you know, we're currently under one of the most severe droughts we've ever had on record in California, and that's taking a huge toll on the agricultural industry, costing, I think the University of California, Davis did a study and estimated that this year there would be about 1.5 billion lost in the agricultural industry due to the drought. Costs seasonal and part-time jobs in the agricultural sector. And that's just for this year's drought. And we expect, due to climate change, that these will occur with greater severity thanks to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And fracking has the potential to make that problem worse by introducing a lot of oil and gas that has previously been inaccessible and bringing that to market and combusting it and releasing it into the air. I was just in New York for the big climate rally, and there's a lot of energy behind doing something about this problem. And all the studies that come out are showing that we have to act fast, and and our window to do something about it is closing. And fracking in California, takes us in exactly the wrong direction at a time when we should be getting ourselves off of fossil fuel, moving towards renewable energy sources. This is just going to take us backwards in that effort and undo a lot of the positive steps that we have made, especially in California, where we've been an environmental leader in a lot of different areas. This is going to undo a lot of that progress. With my remaining time, I want to talk about sort of the legal aspects. Why are we here, as Tom said, when oil companies basically do whatever they want, and there's very little that the public can do, landowners can do to stop new projects from going forward. So why isn't the federal government doing anything? Well, we do have fairly useful laws like the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. These are really landmark environmental laws that have helped clean the air and water in a lot of parts of the country. Unfortunately, you might be familiar with the Halliburton loophole in 2005 that was passed, which exempted hydraulic fracturing from a lot of those basic protections that apply to other industries, to other sources of water, to our air. So the federal government has largely been absent in trying to protect us from the potential harms from fracking. The state, under public pressure in recent years, has attempted to address the question. Unfortunately, what we ended up with was SB 4, which gave us some progress in the area of disclosure, but for the most part, it's been business as usual. Currently, if you want to frack a well, you just fill out some paperwork, and as long as that application is complete, you can go forward and operate your business just the same as you were before. And this is a huge hole in California where normally we like to think of ourselves as progressive on environmental issues, and unfortunately SB4 has really let us down in that respect. Even the disclosure rules that were supposed to give us more information about what's actually happening out there hasn't been implemented very well, and so there are huge data gaps in what's been fracked, where it's been fracked, what chemicals are being used, what chemicals are coming out of the ground, where that waste is being disposed of. All that stuff is patchy at best and completely missing in other areas. So we're still in the dark here. So that's the state level. At the local level, there's also a lot of groundswell for taking public health and safety into the hands of local governments, where these communities that are affected by the effects of fracking want to do something at the local level, through their county government or through their city government. And so you're seeing a lot of ordinances get drafted. Currently, the city of LA is putting together an ordinance to ban fracking. San Benito County and Santa Barbara County have gathered enough signatures to put an initiative forward that would ban fracking in their counties, and that's going to appear on the November ballots this year. If they get a majority of votes, that's a ban on fracking that can't be undone by the city or county government. It takes a new initiative to undo the work of a previous initiative. So that's where a lot of the energy is right now, and it's largely a result of the federal and state governments not doing enough, not taking health and safety and the environment seriously and giving it a priority. And that's why we're seeing a lot of action at the local level, and we expect that to continue to spread in California. In New York, where they have a moratorium, it started with townships and larger towns, and then to counties, and then eventually there's enough pressure from enough places that this entire state passed a moratorium. And so we're hoping that that'll be the same case in California.
Okay, thanks, Holland. Mark?
You want me to bat cleanup?
Mark was telling me before the start that he comes from a farming and forestry background, is that true?
Yes.
So, good luck.
Years at USDA and actually working on climate change, helping to write the Waxman-Markey bill, as a matter of fact. Yeah, I'm almost befuddled where to start, so I'm just going to have about 3 minutes, and then we're going to go to dialogue here, because I'm actually quite interested in hearing from many of you what it is that you're thinking. A couple of things. We ran workshops almost within about 4 months after I was appointed. And I was appointed in January 2012 by Governor Brown, and instantly the issue of hydraulic fracture stimulation or fracking was on our plate, because January I was appointed, March is our first budget meetings, and the topic of great concern was, of course, why was it that the division in my department, the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, had been funded and explicitly told, according to your local legislator here, that we had been told to go do fracture stimulation regulations. Why had we not done it? So I show up, kind of, farm boy PhD from USDA, kind of going, right, let's take a look at this. The fact is that California does in fact regulate hydraulic fracture stimulation. We just didn't happen to have a fracking regulation. Now we do. SB 4 was signed by the governor almost exactly a year ago, September 2014 or 13, and we were put on a very, very tight timeline. Literally within weeks, we had regulations into the Office of Administrative Law that would become effective on January 1 this calendar year. The purpose was so as to avoid any further perception, as Holland points out, that there were no fracking regulations. In fact, they went into effect in an interim form so that we could take the time, and it takes a long time to develop the permanent regulations. Those permanent regulations will hit the streets probably in the next couple of weeks. They will be effective by law. They must be not effective, but they must be finished by January 1. The trailer bill in the budget last year, or this fiscal year, essentially extended the deadline for them being effective, so they will be effective July 1, 2015. And that was simply to align the calendars, because also due at that time is a large-scale EIR statewide on hydraulic fracturing and other forms of well stimulation. There is the independent scientific study that Seth is part of. It's basically founded on the work that was done for the BLM that was just presented a couple of weeks ago, and then will be extended with current data that's currently being gathered from reported fracture jobs. Almost no acid stimulation is used in the state, so most of the stimulation jobs that are reported are hydraulic fracturing, and as you say, most of them are in western Kern County. it's important for you to understand that while this governor is very much probably the strongest climate advocate of any governor seen in recent years, and he will be speaking before the UN tomorrow, and I think many of you have probably heard him be quite adamant that climate change is the issue of our generations. And there is no contradiction between Governor Brown being a very strong climate change and renewable energy advocate, and also essentially being very pragmatic about the fact that California burns approximately 2 million gallons per hour of hydrocarbon fuels in transportation, in natural gas, jet fuel, etc. California produces approximately 38% of its total consumption in hydrocarbons, largely crude oil. Natural gas is no longer produced in any major volume here because of the gas coming from the east being much cheaper, but there has been a history of producing natural gas in the state of California. California is the third largest oil producer in the country, and yet at 600,000 barrels per month, we only produce 38% of what is actually required to run this economy. I don't think anybody disagrees in this administration that we must move off of hydrocarbon resources. We simply must. But the pragmatics, and all of human civilization, I think, is a testimony to this. Jared Diamond is one of my heroes, is the fact that all civilization is the result of the concentration of energy. And all well-being and increases in well-being in human society is the result of increasing BTU, or kilocalorie per capita, concentration for human beings. So the fact is we are in a hydrocarbon economy, and this governor is very, very pragmatic about that. I will not choose to debate some of the reporting issues that Holland has written about and talked about today, but I would suggest that this is an entirely new regime, not just for the state, but for the industry itself. And we can talk more about that as we get into a dialogue here. So I'll just cap it off right there.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm really pleased we've got some context, you know, the carbon economy and climate change. Could we just really quickly address another contextual matter which would help us understand what's at stake here? And that's sort of the historical context is, where are we in terms of further development of oil and gas in California? Are we on, I mean, you get the sense that we're on the verge of this huge push. Are we? I mean, what's the threat now in terms of increased development of oil and gas in California using fracking?
If I may, the Energy Information Agency contracted with Intech LLC about 4 years ago to do an analysis of the available, potentially available, technically recoverable crude oil available in the Monterey Shale, as it's commonly known. It's actually many different shales, many different layers, all twisted around, and that is known as the source rock from which rises the oil that's now trapped in anticlines that has been traditionally oil production. The question is, can you go to the source rock and get the oil out? As far as we can tell, Intech Corporation grossly overestimated the recovery rate, the density of wells, the production curve of those wells, and therefore was reporting 15.4 billion barrels available in the Monterey Shale. As most of you know, that was revised downward by 96%. Now they're saying 0.6 available in the Monterey Shale. I would urge you to simply doubt both of those numbers. We do not know, at least my department and even the Energy Commission does not track necessarily the issues of the Energy Information Agency, but there was, I think, just a burst of enthusiasm over the Monterey Shale that now is kind of, you know, the bubble has burst. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I think that was actually a good representation of technically recoverable resources in the Monterey Shale, the source rock proper. And I'm just going to dip a little bit back into the way that Ed opened it up about how it's not just fracking. And Ed said it's not just hydraulic fracturing, it's not just stimulation, it's also innovations in drilling technologies, directional drilling, horizontal drilling. But it's also, especially in California, not just fracking, because the majority, almost probably the majority, I'm not actually sure, but a lot of the oil that's being pulled out of the ground in California has nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing. There is a lot of, there are questionable amounts, but there are billions of barrels of technically recoverable migrated oil that still exist in these anticlines, that still exist under these traps in pools, basically. And a lot of these pools are lower permeability. You don't need to crack anything to get the oil to move. What you need to do is actually oftentimes heat up the oil, because this migrated oil is pretty heavy. And so technologies such as steam injection, actually mechanically moving this heavy tar-like oil to places where it can be developed. People use water flooding, just basically injecting a whole bunch of water and moving the oil to a new location to be developed. So there is more oil to be developed, and not all of it is going to be directly from the Monterey Shale. So I will leave it there.
This would seem, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I'm most familiar with what's happening in the Bakken in western North Dakota. And there, I mean, the state has said there we are going to drill and develop every square inch of that oil field as rapidly as we can, and they are going about the process of doing it. But it seems like there's an opportunity here, simply because it's going to be more daunting to get at some of the oil and gas, for a new regime of regulations, monitoring, enforcement, that sort of thing. Could you all try to address that as a? I mean, we'll get to the question of whether we should have it at all, but I mean, in the interim, what can we do on the Mark said there's new regulations coming down the pike. Any reaction to that?
I definitely think there are lessons to be learned from North Dakota's experience, and we're seeing more and more the costs to health, the costs to the environment. Towns are scrambling to try and keep up with infrastructure needs, to try and patch up the roads, to create towns where there were no towns in existence before, and have schools and have hospitals and fire and emergency departments to keep up with the rush. And so the lessons from North Dakota surely can inform our approach to fracking in California. I think those, when you add up all the problems, it leads to the conclusion that it's the only true way to protect our health and our environment is to prohibit the practice.
If I can,
sure, Mark, jump in.
Not directly object, but sort of offer another perspective here, which is it's not about fracking. It's about oil development. And everything that we can observe of the workshops and the feedback that we're getting on our regulations, most of the concerns have to do with surface impacts, whether it is land use, which I think everybody here knows is 3 votes on Tuesday. It's not the department that makes a land use decision. It's the local government, municipalities, counties. And it is about the management of oil development resources on the surface, whether it's illegally dumping stuff into unlined sumps, which is illegal in California, or it's lots and lots of trucks. I think everybody will have a chance to see when the EIR comes out, we're looking at the administrative draft right now, that fracking per se adds a very, very small margin of additional traffic, of additional air pollution, of additional water use. It's actually the entire oil development issue that is of concern. And so I think in some ways people have been a little bit distracted by fracking, not helped by the fact that Pennsylvania frankly didn't do a very good job of responding to a multiple magnitude increase in production over about 6 years, and just couldn't handle it. North Dakota is barely keeping up. California, I think, is probably better suited because of the California Environmental Quality Act and other ways that people tend to monitor what happens in local land use decisions. But we don't have an oil boom going on here, as does North Dakota.
Go ahead. Yes.
I just want to not totally disagree with everything, but I will say that it's hard. While the surface impacts are the ones that we see, it's difficult to understand what the subsurface impacts might be if we're not monitoring well. So a few months ago, we evaluated all 75,000 oil and gas wells in the state of Pennsylvania, all of the inspection records, and what had been done before to look at whether wells were leaking in the subsurface may or may not be contaminating groundwater. What we found was that the studies before this had just merely added up the times when the regulatory industry, in this case the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, had come out and said, you get a violation because your well is leaking. We thought that that was a little bit of a weird way to count up potential pathways, subsurface pathways. So what we did is we went through the comments and we identified issues that were very clearly associated with failure of cement, failure of steel casing, migration of oil and gas up and around the wellbore. These are issues not only for the potential contamination of aquifers, but also for the emission of methane and other volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere. And what we found was that there's a lot of indicators that wells are leaking, and this was corroborated by a more recent study that came out of Canada, out of Maurice Dassault's shop up at University of Waterloo, that showed that at least 15% of the wells up there are leaking, and that's not even looking into the future. After we punch all the holes in the ground, how are we going to monitor subsurface impacts 50, 75, 100 years into the future? So while I agree that surface impacts are most easy to see, I think you don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. And we haven't done a very good job of inspecting subsurface migration of fluids, for example.
I would disagree, but we can leave that for another time.
Well, this is a sort of a subset of this. And Tom, you focused, I know that you have a lot of concerns, but you focused on, in your examples, on injection wells. Can we talk a little bit about monitoring injection wells? Just maybe explain the difference between, say, a new well. What are used for, what are we using for wells to inject this stuff into first?
Obviously, they're using the old oil wells.
How old? Really old ones?
No.
No?
But at least 10 years old in my limited experience.
So that when the oil well is exhausted, then it's a candidate for becoming an injection well.
Well, I just know that they're injecting down holes that were originally had oil pumps on them. Okay. And I don't know how much pressure, if you can, I think they're told not to put more pressure down there than what was there originally, but who's checking in the end?
We are.
Yeah. That's what I'm afraid of. Now, it's like they're drilling. 95% of the fracking is on the west side of Kern County where there's no usable groundwater, although I think all water is ultimately usable. It just means it's high in salts already. So the regulations have always been pretty lax out there because there was nothing they thought to worry about no matter what practice they did. So now they're where we know we have excellent groundwater. It's a minor part of the fracking now, but it's expanding. We don't know what's in the Monterey Shale, but this could be the tip of the iceberg in the sense of thousands of new wells where there's prime farmland and good groundwater. And I don't think we're taking that possibility serious enough right now by making us special rules for that type of area. I don't see, there is talk about if the groundwater's good, you have to do some extra reporting. And there's so much going on. Just the other day, I saw a wildcat well in an alfalfa field where there hadn't been any drilling before by the same company, Vintage or Occidental. It's a new location. You know, they're trying it there, and they're going to try it here. Now they can't use the pit for the drilling mud any longer because they are above good groundwater. So trucks are hauling the drilling mud away. So I talked to the truck drivers, where are you taking the drilling mud? And they said, oh, 60 miles up the road to Avenal. I said, what? There's a landfill 3 miles away from here in one direction, and there's a hazardous waste landfill 6 miles in the other, yet you're driving it 60 miles away to another county to get rid of it. What's going on? I have no idea, and I don't think anybody else does either. But something's going on that's not being regulated there.
Mark, do you have, I mean, let's just agree for sake of argument that we have really strong regulations. Do you even have the resources to monitor what's going on? I mean,
we do. The way regulation works in California, it varies from state to state, is the cost of regulation is calculated on an annual basis, and the division establishes a per barrel or per 1,000 cubic foot assessment. Previously, it's been floating somewhere between 12 and 14 cents per barrel. This last budget year, we established it at 28.6 cents. We more than doubled it. And the reason for that is not just to meet the purposes of SB4 implementation, although the independent science study and the EIR are one-time major expenses, but we expect to have ongoing expenses associated with new data development. We have replaced in the last 2 years almost all of the server platforms in the department and have entirely new technology architecture to deal with new data. Under the regime required by SB4, we will be collecting an enormous amount of groundwater data, chemistry being used, total disclosure. Effectively, there are no trade secrets allowed in California. Increasingly, Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, and Halliburton are essentially doing away with their trade secret claims. So we will have an enormous amount of data. I think Seth and his team, in doing the study for BLM, only had about 6 weeks worth of the new data regime to actually analyze. And once they get our study underway, they will have well over a year's worth of data. I wish it were an enormous amount more. Now, here's a very important distinction. Any one of you in this audience, any one of you here, can go online, go to the department's, the division's website, pick a well, and go in and pull up, sometimes it's 150 pages of scanned, detailed records of everything that's happened there. Much of it is handwritten. That's information. It's not data. And unfortunately, the division has been rather depauperate in financing its data management resources so that much of the information in those individual well files could actually be data. And if I had an army of Benedictine monks I could put together for 2 years, we would pull that information out of those paper files and put it into actual data resources. And we'd be doing different kinds of analyses. Going forward in the next 5 or 10 years, it's an entirely different analytical regime.
Seth?
So, I mean, I think it's true that there will be a lot more information on 3 different types of well stimulation in California. Those are the only, so the 3 types are hydraulic fracturing, matrix acidizing, which is where you don't crack anything, you put hydrofluoric and hydrochloric acid at volumes necessary to dissolve the formation or dissolve wormholes in the formation as opposed to cracking, and acid fracturing, which is a sort of a blend between hydraulic fracturing and matrix acidizing. That said, I want to come back again to points that have come up a few times, which is that it's not hydraulic fracturing per se, it's oil and gas development. You know, when I talked about the subsurface pathways with oil well bores and potential leaks, that probably has very little to do with hydraulic fracturing, why wells leak, and has more to do with just the fact that you drilled a hole in the ground and cement doesn't stick around in its intact form forever. Same thing goes for the rest of oil development. I think that one of the biggest pitfalls of SB4 is that it doesn't actually put higher standards on the rest of oil development in the state. It doesn't put higher standards on steam injection, water flooding, other forms of enhanced oil recovery, which when you go down to the South Coast Air Quality Management District collects a huge amount of data. They've done a pretty good job actually of collecting chemistry data on what gets put down into wells. And if you look, take out all the hydraulic fracturing, there's some questions about matrix acidizing, but we'll just pretend like that doesn't happen in the South Coast. There's a huge number of wells in and around the LA basin. Very few of them use hydraulic fracturing, but a lot of them use a lot of chemicals, and there are a lot of those chemicals that are still under trade secret formats. So that's an issue. It doesn't, I'm glad that somebody's looking a little bit more closely at hydraulic fracturing and well stimulation, but there is an oil industry that is not unregulated by any stretch, but is free to act in certain ways without as much disclosure as I think most of the public. And frankly, as a scientist who requires data inputs to be able to provide concise information about what's going on, it's a problem for me too.
Yeah, I think one of the overarching questions that keeps coming up is, what do you do in the absence of information? Seth's study showed that 3 in 10 chemicals have no information on the toxicity and how it affects our bodies. That information is still being studied, and what do we do in the interim when there are stories of people getting sick, of higher rates of cancer and other serious illnesses, of increased rates of birth defects near active wells? What do you do when you have mounting evidence about the health effects, but no clear information on all of the chemicals or all of the pathways, or what the mechanics of how it gets from oil activity, gas activity, into adverse health consequences? And California right now is saying, let's just go forward with what we've been doing. We're going to write regulations without even completing an EIR, Environmental Impact Report. The scientific study is still being done, and the state is trying to write its regulations before that information even becomes available. So that's, I think, is an incorrect approach. What we should be doing is taking public health and safety seriously and saying nothing goes forward until we have complete information, until we can be assured that our communities are safe. And that's just not being done in California.
Okay, let me add, before we open it up, just one other thing, because we want to keep bringing this back to food and agriculture. We've talked about contamination, contaminating water, migration of contaminants, that sort of thing. The other water issue is just depletion, especially during a time of drought. And so could we quickly address the issue of, is there enough water for both fracking and agriculture. We'll start with you, Tom. Since you're
We obviously don't have enough water because of drought. I mean, I spent $1,000 an acre extra this year over what I spent the year before to irrigate this year. And there's not a question that the oil industry wants the freshest possible water for whatever they're going to do with it, whether it's making steam for steam injection, which is another well stimulation in Kern County, or for fracking, or for the drilling. They need clean water because dirty water fouls up their equipment, just like you can't grow food in it either. So nobody wants the dirty water. So they inject the wastewater back deep into the ground, but they start with fresh water. And they are bringing up water as well that they inject back down, but it all ends up deep in the ground, gone forever. And I believe there's a bill that may require new operations to use recycled water only in the future. In other words, if they're bringing up all this produced water, they got to clean some of it for their future needs. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's kind of like a carbon tax on fuel. You pay the true cost of what your fossil fuel is going to cost you, and then you start using a lot less of it. You find ways to use a lot less. That's one more way that I think the society needs to force the oil industry to pay the true cost of oil extraction, is to not use fresh water anymore and totally contaminate it while they're...
Where does the fresh water come from in Kern County?
Well, I've seen the oil companies hook up to surface water supplies, which is the most immediate fresh snow melt water that you could ever get, the purest water you could get, which is coming to our area through a 50-year-old federal water system called the Kern Canal. And the oil companies can get rights to that water directly through the farmer. I don't even know if it's legal. This is subsidized, federally subsidized water, but they're buying it from the farmer, not from the federal government. The farmer has the rights to it, so they'll pay a large amount of money for that water. And they're also paying farmers to pump their groundwater, and they're being very generous in how much they'll pay. So most farmers tend to look at it as a positive in that they're making a little extra money. But in the long term, when you look at hundreds and then thousands of wells, it starts to make a really negative difference. Contamination of water is a far bigger threat than water they use right now. I mean, the ultimate groundwater contamination is even worse. But yeah, they're using over 100 billion gallons of fresh water in Kern County alone every year, in my opinion, from numbers I've seen. But
sounds maybe a little high.
100 billion gallons of fresh water?
With all the steam injection?
They're using a lot of water.
Who knows the answer to that? Who can tell me what it is?
Well, let me put this in proportion. We will be able to answer this if the governor signs 1281, SB 1281, because it'll obligate the department and the water board to actually get data about the source of water and its use and disposal. And that, I think, will be helpful. I would wonder if perhaps other industries are to follow fairly quickly, like Grimway Farms or some of the organic producers down there. But I can tell you, let me put something into perspective. Most oil production in California is really water production. A very, very good, what's called a water cut in California, which is the percentage of water to oil, is about 95% water, 5% oil. That's a really good water cut. It's typically more like 97, 98% water, 2 or 3% oil. In a given year, on average, oil production in California pulls up about 120 billion gallons a year and re-injects 95% of that. About 5% of that is actually fresh enough water that it goes to recharge ponds. In San Ardo, for example, in southern Monterey County, about 250,000 gallons of fresh water per month is pulled out of the oil formations. It's so clean that it gets recharged into the Salinas River watershed. It's quite clean. It's treated by Chevron with reverse osmosis to get all the BTEX and all that stuff out of it. In Kern County, I think our rough our rough calculation in 2013 was the net contribution from the oil industry of fresh water that would not otherwise be available was 24,000 acre feet in the state of California. So I don't know where the 100 billion gallons comes from. It's a little intimidating.
Well, like you said, they're injecting well over 100 billion gallons of water.
Yeah, most of it is very high TDS water, that total dissolved solids, very salty water. Much of that is 500,000, about 10 times more salty than the ocean. Some of it is actually very, very clean. And I think that the sensitivity here is quite justified. As you know, Holland, you pointed out as well, this is not the first time we'll have a drought. This ideally will not last another year, but it could. And quite logically, if we're talking about desal plants, they're taking 35,000 TDS water out of the Pacific Ocean and providing fresh water for consumption, then why shouldn't we be looking at water coming up from oil wells that's 10,000, 15, 20,000 TDS and thinking about treating that? So Chevron is, for example, considering becoming a water purveyor. They may have a valuable commodity on their hands. We don't know. You laugh.
Well, that would be ironic.
You
have
laugh.
to say.
I mean, so we're worried about water, I think, in three main ways. And the first two are immediate, so the oil companies withdraw fresh water that would otherwise maybe be used for municipalities or for drinking water or for farming. That's the first way. The second way is the possibility of contamination. The water that we have left in aquifers might get contaminated, and what was once high-quality water that could either be used for drinking or irrigation now becomes contaminated with BTEX chemicals and other toxics that are present in oil and gas or in fracking fluids. And I think the third way is what we talked about earlier with climate change. The more we produce oil, the more we burn it off, the more likely and the more severe droughts are in the future. So the long-term effects are just depleting our water even more. And so it's water use, especially in California, is a huge concern for us.
Okay, yeah, lots to chew on there. So let's open it up to the audience. Sure, over here.
Hi, yeah.
We've got a mic too.
Hi, my name's Martin Helmack. I had a question about water treatment, which you just mentioned that Chevron is proposing to treat it. Is there any state legislation that would set standards for it so that, I mean, we've had Superfund problems for 40 years, and we pump polluted water and then treat it using activated carbon or some other technology and then re-inject it. Is there any such program being considered by the state to recover water, especially since we have a drought and we're waterless? And also, whether there's any remedial measures that the oil companies could take, such as fixing leaks in our water supply, such as the peripheral canal. If they're going to contaminate water, could they be asked to spend money on fixing leaky old water conveyance infrastructure? Is there any such legislation being considered? Because it seems like a good idea to me, because we can't make it rain, but we can stop wasting the water we have.
So I'm trying to parse your question a little bit. There are 3 or 4 questions that I hear in there. First of all, there are already standards for treating water and for consumption. So I'm not, whether it's out of an aquifer, wherever it comes from. So I'm not exactly sure what the nature of your question is. Would there be standards for treating produced water that's associated with oil? I would think that if that's going to become a source of usable consumptive use water, I would suspect that it would be subject to the same kinds of standards. It's also very important for folks to understand that remediating a polluted aquifer is an enormous challenge. And there are very, very few aquifers that have been polluted that have actually been returned to their original state. Most of it is basically as much mitigation and stopping the bleeding, triage as much as possible, whether it's aerojet and chemicals from rocket production or whatever. So I'm not sure I'm getting at your question, but it seems to me that of interest will be water from whatever source. The Safe Drinking Water Act, and I'll shut up after saying this, but it has 4 provisions, non-associated provisions, by which an aquifer can be exempted. One of which is that there is no economical or mechanical or physical likelihood that the water would be used for beneficial use. How do you set that bar? Because that goalpost is moving right now. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that might have been exempted in the 1980s when the state got its primacy agreement for oil and gas. I mean, we've been regulating oil and gas for 100 years in California, including injection and fracturing. In 1980, with the Safe Drinking Water Act provisions, we received primacy from EPA for the underground injection control program, and what was exempted then might not be exempted now, given what we know.
I think maybe another part of your question was whether there are any sort of legal requirements or limitations on the amount of water that can be used, and the answer to that is no. Are there any requirements, like a minimum amount of water that has to be recycled by an oil company, and that's also no.
I think the challenge, I'm sorry for jumping in here, but the challenge, and I'm a regulator. I'm not an oil producer, right? So just be careful how you hear what I'm saying. The challenge from the oil companies is, well, why exactly us? Because there are a bunch of chip manufacturers, most of them moved to China and Ireland and Spain, but there are a bunch of manufacturers in the Bay Area who are using state-developed water for enormously high-value production. Shouldn't they be regulated in their water consumption? Should Grimway Farms be regulated in how much it gets to use? Should Tom be regulated in how much he gets to use on his 36 acres? I mean, they're very naturally kind of saying, well, where's the equity here?
I don't think anyone's saying somebody should get a free pass. I mean, residents are fined now for using too much water. Why is it that we have to pay a fine for using such a minuscule amount compared to large industries that for now have been getting a free pass, and there's no fairness or equity in that?
I think at the issue as I see it is I think there is an equity issue. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as a poor oil and gas industry. They're not subject to the same rules as others. But I would say that in the state of California, each well does consume less water than in other states. Now, some might throw up their hands and say, "Oh, no problem. We consume less water. It's not that much." But the issue really is where is that water coming from and where is it being consumed? Water consumption in the San Joaquin Valley is really important. 17 communities over the past year have lost access to their normal sources of drinking water. We're in a water strap situation here. So if you take water consumption from oil and gas and look at it at the state level, it doesn't, it's not that big, but that's really not that's not the issue. The issue is water consumption in water-strapped areas. And there have been some really good studies that have come out recently that have looked at this within this frame of water-strapped local areas where oil and gas development is a big consumer across the nation, and it's something definitely to pay attention to. But what I want to get out there is that we shouldn't be putting water consumption of oil and gas next to water consumption of agriculture, because that's not the correct comparison. That's not. It's a stacking on top of agriculture. So.
Okay, we've got a question here. Yep.
Yeah. I think all water in the state should be regulated. But anyway, I have 2 questions for Mark. And one is, I understand that wastewater from fracking and other extreme oil extraction methods of offshore wells, that wastewater is being dumped directly into the ocean. And I was wondering if your department is regulating that at all, or if not, which department would be regulating that? And wait, my second question is, I'd like to know why the state of California doesn't have a moratorium on fracking until the EIR is completed.
Let me answer the second one first. It's quite simple. The governor signed SB 4 with the intention of regulating hydraulic fracturing and other stimulation, and therefore was not interested in a moratorium. Hydraulic fracturing has been used in this state since the 1950s. I'm not going to say there is no problem, because as Seth and others have pointed out, we haven't looked as hard as we are looking now. So I can't say, I mean, I'm a scientist by training, so I couldn't honestly say no problem with fracking. We have had no observable upset directly related to a hydraulic fracture job. There's been one reported incident in the thousands of frac jobs that have taken place in California. The second, I have heard similar things as well, offshore. When I got to my department, I told my entire staff, you don't get to say it's not my job. However, I'm going to say that's actually not our jurisdiction offshore. That's state lands for the first 3 miles, and then it's federal after that. And water disposal from any kind of oil and gas operation is highly regulated by the feds and by the State Lands Commission. And now, anything going overboard on a platform is illegal. If you go visit a platform, you will find huge collection cisterns, because they're not even allowed to let runoff from the decks go into the ocean. So I actually don't know where the data come from about disposal of fracturing or produced water offshore. Seth?
So that's true in the state waters, but in the federal waters, you are allowed to throw overboard your produced water.
On the assumption that it's lower TDS than the surrounding water. You know,
with a TDS
talk to that
threshold,
guy.
with a TDS threshold,
Yeah.
without monitoring for anything else that might be included in the fracturing fluids or that might be naturally occurring that gets mobilized when produced water comes back to the surface.
Okay, let's try another one. Yep, you got the mic.
This question's for Mark and Seth specifically. I've been looking at a lot of the kind of bills coming out of the California State Department, and it does seem like there are being changes made and a lot of improvements made in regulating the oil industry. However, one thing I keep on seeing that kind of mystifies me is the abundance of trade secrets and trade secret clauses being introduced everywhere. And you briefly mentioned something about there being a trade secret on kind of the unknown chemicals being pumped into the ground. And I was just wondering why these oil companies and so many people keep on insisting on putting these in, when really shouldn't there be a precedent on knowing what exactly is being put into these wells first?
The principle you just stated is exactly what is in SB 4. The narrowness of the opportunity to make a trade secret claim and the lift it would take to pursue a trade secret claim with regard to stimulation, fracking, acid, whatever, is so high that you virtually do not have any room to make a trade secret claim. The justification for trade secrets, whether it's oil and gas, chip manufacturing, or even Coca-Cola, is that you're protecting intellectual property and recovering essentially profit from the intellectual property. That's the basis of all uniform trade secret acts. Did that answer your question, or did I just slide right by it?
Well, I'm just going to parse apart two things, and I may have been unclear in my last remarks about the South Coast. So again, yes, SB 4, it's going to be very difficult to put a trade secret claim in there. When I talked about how 3 in 10 compounds that had been identified as being more than infrequently put into stimulation fluids that have no toxicological information on them. That's not a trade secret issue. We have kind of a crappy chemical policy in the United States where you can introduce chemicals to the market, to the environment, before you have good toxicological information on whether they're hazardous or not. Again, that 30% issue is different from when you step outside of these 3 different types of well stimulation into the arena of oil and gas development, which is a big deal in California. We do a lot of it. Once you step out of hydraulic fracturing, matrix acidizing, and acid fracturing, anything that goes downhole is not subject to SB4, is not subject to chemical disclosure in the same way. And so that's when you start seeing trade secrets popping up. And if you want to go look, you can go to the South Coast Air Quality Management District. They have a really growing, enormous amount of data that looks at oil and gas development in general, not just those 3 different types of well stimulation.
Yeah, I've been on that website a lot and looked through the database. And basically, if you pump a mixture of acid down and it's for well stimulation, matrix acidizing, then the SB4 provisions apply, and you have to disclose those chemicals and what you put in there. However, if you call it well maintenance, then that's exempted from SB4, exempted from the trade secret disclosure rules. And in the South Coast, they still ask you to report on that activity. Problem is now that it's outside of SB4, they put those trade secret claims back in there, and there's thousands of those trade secret claims just in the first year of reporting for South Coast's regime.
Let's do one more question or wrap it up here.
Hi, I'm Adam Coten with the California Climate and Agriculture Network. I had a question about state and local interactions on this issue, as far as, I guess, sort of what is the interplay, when Tom is identifying some issues, it sounds like maybe a failure of the regional water board. Mark, you're recognizing that land use decisions at the local level are playing a big role in this. Sort of what is the interplay between local governments and the state government on this issue? Perhaps where should it be going or can it be going? And then also, I think, Mark, you mentioned assessments and conversations that have been had with local stakeholders. I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but as far as conversations between the department and local farmers and agriculturalists, sort of what's the direction on that? What kinds of mechanisms are there for those conversations to occur?
I can take the first one, I guess. The California Constitution reserves local governments the police power and land use power. Anything that affects their jurisdiction, whether it's land use or health and safety, aesthetics, noise and light pollution, that sort of local issue, is controlled by local governments at the city or county level. One of the most powerful tools that they have is zoning and land use ordinances, where basically the city and county get to decide what can happen where within their city boundaries. And that's been enshrined in the Constitution. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court. So that's been the impetus behind a lot of cities and counties in the last year who have wanted to put bans or tougher restrictions in place on fracking. And so we're seeing a lot of that in California and more as we go forward.
Adam, I think you might have been picking up on something I referred to very briefly, was the workshops that we did just after I got here, before Fran Pavley decided that she would just simply write SB4. We were already circulating a draft regulation, a discussion draft regulation on hydraulic fracturing. We held 7 workshops around the state, several listening sessions. You know, I think probably the biggest transformation that you don't have to trust me on this, just observe as we go forward in oil and gas production is enormous transparency. And it's a kind of bright light transparency that the oil and gas industry has just never had to deal with. They were basically the people who got what they needed because they produced energy for the world. And now in California and in many other places, oil and gas, there are some very progressive ones who will say, hey, let's go meet with our stakeholders. You know, I come from forestry and agriculture, and I remember what it was like when we had the timber wars. And people didn't know where their wood came from, don't know where their milk comes from, don't know where their water comes from. And now they want to know where their gas comes from. And my advice to the industry is constantly open up your arms and let them in, because they will crawl in and beat you up if you don't. So just pay attention, invite people in. The irony for me is that my department also has responsibility for the Williamson Act and farmland conservation. So, Tom, I come down to your neighborhood all the time, Wasco, Shafter, trying to do essentially ag land protection strategies and facilitating this relationship, especially in Kern County, Santa Barbara County, many heavy oil producing and ag counties, between the mineral rights owners and surface owners. Unfortunately, there's been a long history, particularly in your neighborhood, Tom, where the way of resolving surface landowner and mineral rights owner controversies was to basically throw them both in a burlap bag and tie it shut and shake them up a while and see who walks out. And that's just not the way it's going to happen in the future. Kern County is changing. They have an ordinance in place that says basically you must go to the landowner and at least have a surface access agreement. AB 1961, same thing. So increasingly, our world is kind of shrinking, our margins are shrinking. The expectation is that in the middle of nowhere, which is always the middle of somewhere to somebody, there is no middle of nowhere anymore. Even in the desert, in the San Joaquin Valley, anywhere in California. So you don't get to act as if you're in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, well, I guess we'll leave it there. We've run over a little bit, but thank you all very much. And the conversation will continue.
I also would like to thank you all for coming and really appreciate your staying and participating in the discussion. And we have an opportunity to continue that discussion over refreshments in the reception area here or in the hallway just after. So please join us. And we also have, just so you know, the Berkeley Food Institute is sponsoring these forums every month. And our next one will be on October 20th. And it will be on a different topic completely, but also related to food and agriculture, which is on the paradox of obesity, looking at social dimensions of obesity. So hope you can join us for that discussion. Thanks again, and thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.